Hello and a very warm welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. Today I'm joined by Keith Brown, who is the Minister for Transport and Veterans in the Holyrood Parliament. Welcome, Keith.
Good afternoon.
How are you?
I'm fine, bearing up well.
Yeah, you've put in a deputy leadership bid for the SNP. That's on the back of 2 years hard pounding for the referendum.
That's right, but that's true, of course, of my two opponents as well.
True, and of Angela and Stuart, yeah. Where did you get the stamina from?
Well, I suppose we're in the groove as far as campaigning goes, so that helps, but these opportunities you only get once in a lifetime, I think, and you have to take the chance when it comes up.
So you're going to be basically on the road at Hustings up until, for the next 3 weeks?
Almost exactly 4 weeks today is the result, so between now and then it's non-stop hustings and meetings, yeah.
And you've got a lot of people to meet. There's 65,000 new members, which takes your tally to about 85,000 members?
It's around 84,000 just now, yeah.
Wow, that's incredible. So what's your message to these people? What can you do with that energy that's coming in across the board of all talents, of all ages it would seem? How can you, in your role as Deputy Leader, should you win, channel that?
Well, a defining aspect of the role of Deputy Leader is policy development. And I think what the people that I've met, both during the referendum campaign and especially since, what they want is to be involved and also to be given work to do. They want to be involved in setting the policy of the party, and that makes it a key role for the Deputy Leader. So I've suggested, for example, we should have a much more active policy development process with regional assemblies around the country, making it easy for people to get to those assemblies to help formulate policy. I've also advocated that those new members should have the right to vote in the Westminster selection process, which is coming up. I think it's absolutely essential that being fired up with that kind of enthusiasm, it's very important that the first democratic contest that we have, democratic procedure, that they're involved in that. So there's a great deal to be done to make sure we can facilitate policy development, give them the chance to be involved in the party, and also melding together both the existing members and the new members.
You've got electronic voting now, I believe, which would make that process more manageable. Do you think that would change the direction of the party or the policy of the party across the board with, trebling your membership? There's going to be a lot of people with different views in there.
Well, another journalist said to me, is this not an issue for you? You've got these, at that time, 50,000 new members, and you could take policy in any particular direction that I or others might not like. But to be honest, I don't see it that way at all. I think it's a fantastic opportunity. The energy and the resources which it gives us are huge, and I think the other parties would give their eye teeth to have that kind of a huge increase in membership. So I see it's a real opportunity and a very exciting one.
Yeah, I suppose it comes down to what your manifesto as such is for the deputy leadership. Could you maybe take some time to articulate? You've talked about regional assemblies, you've talked about increasing the internal party franchise for the Westminster parliamentary elections. What else would you suggest?
Well, for example, we have, as you rightly say, a cross-section of society coming to the SNP, but a large number of young people. And so in particular, I've said that we should develop a youth academy. We have a women's academy already, which has been extremely useful for the women that have been involved in bringing forward some inexperienced new members who are women to help them develop policy, but also how to become a parliamentary or local government candidate. And I think we can do something similar in terms of the young people coming into the party. So a youth academy. And the other thing I would say is in terms of local government, because we have this new resource, we have the largest number of councillors in Scotland, and they don't benefit very often from the same support that, for example, MSPs or government ministers would have. So I've advocated a dedicated resource for our local government councillors in order they can better develop policy and stay in touch with the rest of the party.
That sounds an intriguing idea. Could you maybe expand on that? So it would sit somewhere in Scotland, and it would be a team of, what would it be?
No, it would be in headquarters.
Right.
And we have had this in the past. We've had a dedicated person at headquarters that was able to help out with council groups and develop policy as well. So I would see it being the same way. I mean, for a long time now, it's been a question of resources which has prevented it from happening. But the councillors have wanted to see this. I'm a former councillor and council leader myself. I know how important it can be. So both that dedicated resource and also a regular meeting with the Scottish Cabinet and the Scottish Government and our local authority leaders as well. I think that would help us bind the party together.
Because we all the new members need to feel part of it, and it's talking across levels as opposed to a top-down organisation, which I think perhaps Angela was talking about, Angela Constance, one of your rivals for this position, was talking about the Yes Coalition and how, you know, as part of the role as deputy leader of the SNP, you'd have to reach out to the wider Yes movement. How would you go about doing that?
Well, I think that's really an issue for the policy development of the party. So I think the party, and including the new members, have to set the terms of what that engagement is. And there are some parameters that we can't really cross. For example, you can't do joint canvassing for data protection reasons apart from anything else. But there are other things we can do, and I think the party itself, as well as having to adapt to make sure that we involve the new members, that we're inclusive and a welcoming party. I think similarly with the other elements of the Yes campaign, I mean, I don't see why we shouldn't have SNP branches and constituencies inviting along people to speak at their meetings who are from other parts of the Yes campaign, even from other parties. I think that kind of inclusive approach and trying to keep that Yes energy together, that inclusive element of the Yes campaign is very important. Although we do have to concentrate as well on building the party and making sure the party is fit for purpose with these 80,000 plus members.
Fit for purpose being what? What would that mean?
Well, I think first of all you have to make sure that if you have this huge resource, and we've got a cross-section, you've got older people, young people from all social backgrounds, you have to make sure that they have the chance to engage on their own terms. But similarly, the party will want to use those people to carry forward the message that we have. First of all, to put pressure on the Westminster parties to redeem the vow that they made, and beyond that for 2016 to make sure we have the strongest possible representation for the SNP in the next Parliament. So we'll have to make sure that we actually give the chance for every one of those 80,000 members to have the chance to be part of that process.
Yes, and that will take time and energy to get that organised. You run an important brief here frequently in the news last week with the contract awarded to Abilio, if that's the correct pronunciation.
Yeah, there's always things happening in transport briefs. So for example, earlier on today I was at a roads depot talking about the salt stocks that we have for the winter coming up. But there's always these issues on the go. And separately, I think the Abilio contract, which you mentioned, there was some criticism from the Labour Party who said that we shouldn't have let it to that company, despite the fact they themselves had let 2 franchises to that company. But the fact is that it's a perfect example, in fact, of how we're constrained in Scotland. The Railways Act of 1983 means that we can't let it to anybody other than either a private sector bid or not-for-profit bid within the UK, or a public sector bid, strangely enough, from overseas. So the legislation allows for public sector bids, in this case from Holland, but only private sector bids or potentially not-for-profit bids in the UK. Now, I'd written to 3 Secretaries of State asking for them to change that, and they hadn't changed it. The Labour Party had been in government for 13 years, had twice amended the 1993 Act and never changed that. And lo and behold, they're suddenly demanding that we change it and do something that the franchising rules don't allow. So that's a perfect example of where if we had the decision to take in Scotland ourselves, according to our own interests, we could take different decisions.
But this is the best choice in the decision, the powers that you have just now.
Well, that's right. We couldn't consider, and everyone knew that we couldn't consider, for example, a public sector bid from within the UK. We could have accepted a not-for-profit bid, but it's quite difficult to lodge one of those, and one didn't come forward. So we have to take the bids that come forward and take the best one. I should say it's actually a very good bid we have for the membership on the board of the company. We have the headquarters of Abilio in the UK coming to Glasgow now. We've guaranteed a living wage not just for the direct employees but also for the subcontractors related to the franchise. And also a no compulsory redundancy policy for the entire length of the contract. So we have got the best possible bid that we could do within the constraints which Westminster places upon us.
Which is ironic then, given a party devoted to the union then throws that back at you.
Well, that's right, and they were full of inconsistency. For example, they criticised the profits which First Group had made and then asked us to extend the contract beyond April next year, which we couldn't do. And also, as I say, saying that we should give it to an indigenous company, not a foreign company, and then demanding that we allow an indigenous company to bid for contracts overseas. So I think the Labour Party, to be charitable, perhaps they're in the process of thinking through the policy and they're not quite there yet.
That's very charitable indeed. Other people might say they've not got an idea what's happening, but that's other people for you. If we come to the demands of that role and the demands that are going to be inherent in the job of Deputy Leader of the SNP, are they compatible?
Yes, I think they are, and people have done that before now. Nicola Sturgeon has been an excellent deputy leader of the party, at the same time as being not just a deputy First Minister, but also carrying a very heavy portfolio herself in the Scottish Government.
That was in health initially.
Well, in health initially, but she's currently my boss. She deals with infrastructure as well as being very central to the referendum campaign and dealing with cities as well. So she's an exceptional person, I grant that, and she's had a huge workload. This was also one reason why I think the deputy leader of the party has to help with that workload. And I think there's a benefit from working very closely with Nicola and also being very close to party headquarters to actually being in Edinburgh, which is one of the reasons I'm standing.
And Stuart's at a slight disadvantage because he's based in Westminster. But that's just a question of communication is relatively straightforward in that respect. Can maybe we just help people to get to know you a wee bit better? You're also in charge of veterans. Not in charge of veterans, but you have responsibility for the welfare of veterans, is it?
That's right, and it's the first post in the UK to have had veterans in the ministerial title. And there was a report in 2007 which was scathing about the provision for veterans in Scotland, especially in relation to health. And I think we've done a great deal since then to improve the services that we provide for veterans. We're not there yet by any means.
No, but just one of the recent step changes is the Belrock Close Veterans Home in Glasgow, is it?
That's right. Supported accommodation for those veterans that require that, but also dedicated secure tenancies for veterans coming out of the armed forces as well. And I was there yesterday, an absolute fantastic facility which the Scottish Government contributed over £2 million towards. And one of the issues for veterans is housing, adequate and proper housing, and we're trying very hard to deal with that through both housing associations, the veterans organisations and through local councils.
Do you, in that process, do you come against issues of, it's the British Army, it's the MOD's based in London in the main, and you are representing veterans' interests up here? How does that work out?
Well, there are times when there's a bit of friction, especially with the MOD, getting the information out of them, making sure that the MOD has the proper transition arrangements in place for people going from being military personnel to becoming civilians. But despite that, there are a number of areas where we work very well together. We have our own priorities in terms of health, housing. They deal with pensions and things like that, and the two are obviously related, but I think we're getting towards a workable relationship, which has been helped by the very innovative appointment of a Scottish Veterans Commissioner, the first one in the UK, based on or similar to other roles like the Ombudsman in Canada and so on. And so that's another champion for veterans in Scotland, and also somebody who retired at a very senior level from the Royal Navy, knows the MOD, was previously held a very high post in Washington. So that interaction with the MOD, we're working very hard to improve that.
And your interest in veterans is because you are one?
Well, it is, and I asked the First Minister when he asked me to take on the job of transport if I could take responsibility for that. I specifically wanted to do that and felt I could add something to that, and I really enjoy the times I get the chance to meet with veterans and find out about their experiences. And also,
sorry to interrupt. Just for information for the viewers, that Keith was in 4-5 Commando that's in the Royal Marines, right? You saw action in the Falklands War. And how long were you in for, all in all?
Only for 3 years, 1980 to 83.
Right. And how was your experience after having been through, really tough times, I would imagine, in the Falklands, and the adrenaline rush and what have you, potentially for some people traumatic experiences? How did you find the adjustment when you left?
It seemed to be something which, in common with the vast majority of veterans, I seem to get through. I mean, my experience was quite traumatic at the time, obviously, and it's something that you never kind of repeat in your life, or I didn't repeat in my life. You have many veterans coming out that have seen action in all sorts of parts of the world, and far more than I did. But it seemed to be that coming back into civilian life fairly quickly thereafter, went off to university, which gave you a bit of a breathing space. And it seems to have worked okay for me, but I do regularly meet Falklands veterans who have not had it as easy. They've had real difficulties, and it's a real rush if you can get the chance to help people in that situation.
Can I ask how old were you when you joined?
I would have been 19 years old.
19, so you're basically just stepping out of home, and I suppose that's an issue for a lot of people involved, which is that you basically become very well supported in the army. Your food's there, your accommodations there. You don't have to actually attend to, I don't know, life admin duties really. A lot of it's taken care of by the army. Is that one of the issues then that some people fall foul of when they leave the services?
You're exactly right. For some veterans, it is a more scary prospect having to deal with budgeting, running a house, feeding yourself, taking on the responsibilities which civilian life has, than some of the things that they've had to do in the military. It genuinely can be a terrifying experience. And I think what I've tried to concentrate on is making sure that's as easy as possible for veterans, and also that the first time that they look for assistance, whether it's from the local council or the government or the health board, that they get the right answer, and hopefully if they need it, a wraparound service for their different interests. You're absolutely right, that can be the scariest thing which some people coming out of the armed forces, having had that support structure, that environment where a lot is done for them, to actually have to take on the responsibility themselves.
In the provision, I want to just detour here for a little while because it sort of feeds my own interest. In the provision, is there scope for trauma counselling, EMDR usage, various other techniques to help people come to adjustment with trauma?
Yes, so for example, the Scottish Government has given a very substantial grant to Combat Stress, who carry out some of that work. And also here in Edinburgh, Veterans First Point, which is an excellent organisation, a very open door, allows veterans to approach on their own terms, but also has those facilities for counselling and also some pretty involved clinical psychology work as well. So, and of course, right throughout the country, the veterans can access that through their GPs as well. But veterans will often feel more comfortable dealing with veterans or organisations specifically designed to deal with their interests. So we have done quite a substantial amount of work. And as I say, we're not necessarily there yet, but through Combat Stress, Veterans First Point and a number of other organisations, we are providing those services.
I think what's interesting for me listening is that the level of commitment that you're shown to is something that's generally close to where you are.
Well, it is. I asked to do this job in particular, and it can be, in a way, when you're a local councillor, you often get very good feedback. You've managed to help somebody in that circumstance. It's more direct, perhaps, than it is in government. But with veterans, if you can make a difference to people's lives, and sometimes you see that, they've got the help they've been looking for a long period of time. Sometimes you can manage to turn around their whole life in terms of perhaps drug or alcohol addiction, which are often symptomatic of other things. Then it can be a really gratifying post to have.
Well, I'm really pleased that I can through the questioning demonstrate that to viewers to see where it is you're coming from in terms of your commitment to people generally, but particularly the veterans in this case. If we move into matters transport for a second, there's a lot going on. It's a busy brief, as we mentioned. The Borders rail line track is being laid. HS2 is a contentious issue. What, in terms of transport, do you see as your priorities?
Well, you have a distinction between the everyday pressures. We're heading into the winter period just now, so it can become quite demanding in terms of making sure we keep traffic moving around the country. Much easier to say than it is to do.
So you were checking the salt levels today?
Exactly right. We have twice as much salt in place this year as we actually used last year, but that is obviously one pressure. But making sure that the trunk road operating companies are able to get out there and keep the roads open is a big task. Beyond that, trains, there are big issues with our train network. We've invested billions actually in trying to expand the train service and have succeeded in terms of patronage. But it is in very many parts an old infrastructure, and we're trying to replace that, and that produces demands as well. And beyond that, of course, you have the big infrastructure projects like the Forth Crossing, the biggest one we've had in Scotland, which is going extremely well, substantially below budget and on time. And beyond that, you've mentioned the Borders Railway and seeing 1,200 metres of track rolled out every day on the biggest train project of its type in the UK for 100 years is really gratifying.
The biggest for 100 years?
It's the biggest new track that's been laid for a project of that type.
Of course, because the Channel Tunnel was already tracked down to a certain level, so the extension wasn't that great. I suppose one of the things that you benefit from in terms of the party is the focus on infrastructure spend, because then that's designed to generate a multiplier effect in the economy to create more jobs, which the First Minister was tweeting about today. I think it was 40,000 new jobs and more people in activity than were inactivity. Is that right?
Well, that's right, and you're right to say that, because John Swinney and the government took a very particular route when the recession hit, which was to make sure that if they concentrated on capital spend, infrastructure works, which by their nature tend to be labour intensive,
yes,
you have that multiplier effect, you soak up unemployment, And rather than people being on benefits, they're both in work and paying taxes. We don't get the benefit directly of the taxes, but we do get the benefit of people having work. And that's perhaps one reason why you're seeing employment levels substantially higher than the rest of the UK. For the first time, I think, in my lifetime, that's been the case over a consistent period. And why we've had so many people stay in employment. And that helps individual families get through a really tough time as well.
Yeah, it helps them focus on the future rather than just reacting to the present, which I think is an important point. You historically have been involved in a lot of integration of procedures and organisations at the Parliament, is that correct?
Yes, I think that's true when I was doing the education brief as well, yeah.
And what does that bring you in terms of, because I mean, again, the 65,000 and increasing, what do you think it'll be by the end of the year, by the way?
Who knows? I mean, I think what's been interesting is the Chief Executive, Peter Murrell, every time he's put an update out, is also put on how you can get somebody else to join. So we're not putting a ceiling on this. Let's just see how far we can get with the new membership.
It's interesting. Maybe you should have bring a pal along policy.
There's an element of that. There are some memberships which are at much reduced rates, and what's been really gratifying, I did some time in the headquarters processing the applications, is some people can only afford the £5 fee, but they've been that determined they wanted to join the SNP, they've made that effort. And I think we should make it as easy as possible for people to join. And it seems to be, we're knocking at an open door just now. Having run recruitment campaigns, as all parties do for years, this has just been absolutely phenomenal.
Yeah, the bar charts look particularly attractive, don't they? They just go, that's fantastic. Okay, what do you think, let's just move into sort of more macro level politics for the moment then. Although I do want to come back to HS2 and the cost benefit analysis. The First Minister has resigned. Long live the First Minister, and she is now due to take stage in November?
That's right, 14th November.
First of all, how do you see things happening, developing at Holyrood and then at Westminster? Actually, let's go the other way around. Let's go to Westminster first.
Well, Westminster's now very interesting because of first of all, the reaction that you've seen with people joining not just the SNP but pro-independence parties. That says something about how they feel about the referendum they've just been through. But many of those people are very focused on what happens at Westminster, and in particular, if there is backtracking, as there appears to be the case, on the vow, the additional powers, I think there's a real willingness to make sure that people in Westminster know how strongly people felt about independence. And also a number of people, I'm not saying by any means that everybody that voted no was for additional powers, because some weren't, but a number of people were, and they were convinced by the vow that was made to them. So that makes the Westminster election particularly interesting this time, and if you look at the opinion polls, the SNP can be very well placed to increase our representation there. And I think we have to look at what happens at that election and then move forward to 2016, where once again, even at this stage, the polls suggest that the independence parties are going to do extremely well. So, as I say, my real focus in being deputy leader would be to try and make sure that all, however many it is, currently around 84,000 members of the SNP get the chance to participate in that process.
That 84,000, I mean, it's a remarkable figure. I think it's almost going to eclipse Labour's membership outside of London.
I think it already does. I think it is greater than out with London, Labour's UK membership.
But as it stands, the SNP only have 6 MPs in the Westminster Parliament. And I was speaking to Stuart Hosey earlier, and I was saying that they perhaps don't see the true power in the independence parties in Westminster. How can we guarantee that they do?
Well, I think it is. They listen to one thing in terms of Westminster elections, and it's electoral success.
Yes.
That's why the SNP frightened the establishment rigid back in the mid-70s when there was a huge plus 30% vote for the SNP. And I think that's the one thing they listen to. But it's also true to say that the Westminster system, first past the post, is quite a brutal and unforgiving system. You've got to be very fixed and very focused on how you overturn that, in our case, to make sure that we get SNP MPs elected. And I think there is no question that Westminster will have to take notice of a very substantial number of SNP MPs being elected to the Parliament next year, especially if it's been the case in the meantime that they've been backtracking on the promises that they made during the referendum.
The SNP have published their paper on what they want, which is pretty much everything bar foreign policy and defence. Is that right?
That's right.
How realistic is that in terms of the Smith Commission?
Well, we've been accused of trying to achieve independence through the back door, but the fact of the matter is that's what was being offered by people in the no parties. I think Gordon Brown made a comment to that effect, almost exactly the same as Home Rule, which is commonly consented to be, as you said, virtually all powers, out with perhaps defence, foreign affairs and control of the currency. So this is a very realistic and reasonable aspiration for the SNP. I don't know if anybody expected anything different from the SNP, but it's certainly the case that many people, Lib Dems, are supporting federalism. So I'm not so sure why this should be seen as an unreasonable or unlikely request to have those powers.
Not the request isn't unlikely. It's whether it would be passed by the Westminster Parliament or not is, I suppose, the part that's open to dispute.
Well, all I would say is woe betide them if they don't. Gordon Brown has said as much, I think, today as well, that it would be seen as a major betrayal if the powers which have been talked about at this point, sometimes quite vaguely, are not delivered. So it's up to Westminster. They made the promises and they've got to see them through.
A lot of the Tory grandees in Westminster treat the SNP and the independence movement with benign indifference. That's a quote from Stuart Hosey, by the way. I don't want to misattribute it. Benign indifference, but yet Mike Campbell used the First Minister's words to say, we will be holding their feet to the fire too. Do you think maybe independence could come about by happenstance? If the vow is misjudged and the delivery is way under what's expected by either Mike Campbell or Gordon Brown, do you think then they would be duty bound almost to turn against Westminster?
That's a very interesting point. First of all, I'm not so sure that it's always benign indifference, but It is a very interesting point. Gordon Brown in particular, some of the statements he's made in the last couple of days about saying the sense of betrayal that would be abroad in Scotland if it was to be the case that what was delivered was substantially less than that which he's talked about. Where do people like Gordon Brown and Mike Campbell go from there if that's what happens? I mean, it's got to be the case that they have to say, well, Westminster, if it does, it has failed. And, where do they go from there? Do they support our call for more power for Scotland? So I think you're right at the very start when you said it's an extremely exciting period in Scottish politics, a lot happening. And that's, I think, the reason why you've seen the SNP and others attract so many new people into politics.
It's a time for men and women of stamina.
Mm-hmm.
Interesting things can also be a curse in terms of running your immune systems down and getting you colds and what have you. I mean, I suppose you'll get a rest after the 14th of November, will you?
I doubt it. I hope not to. I hope to have a new challenge as Deputy Leader of the SNP at that stage. And I don't think you get these rests in politics anymore, not in Scotland. I think it's, especially if you're in the SNP and if you're in government, of course, the demands are pretty constant, but it's also very stimulating. And I think it's easier to continue, show some resilience if you're really enjoying what you're doing. And I think that would be the case. I hope that will be the case after the 14th of November.
Yes, in terms of the ongoing development. How would you work with Nicola?
Well, I do currently. She's been my boss for the last 2 years. I'm one of the two ministers that reports directly to Nicola.
Who's the other one?
The other one is Margaret Burgess, who does housing.
Uh-huh.
And Nicola is great for a number of reasons, but one is she lets you get on with the job. I mean, she's obviously got to get involved in things when there are larger issues at stake, for example, some of the big infrastructure projects. She's a great ally to have as somebody in the Cabinet for arguing your case for resources. And she's always very open. If you need a bit of advice or if you have a view on something, she's more than willing to take that. But I've had a very good working relationship with Nicola over the last 2 years. I've obviously known her since the 1980s when we both joined the party. So I would have no problem at all working with Nicola.
Well, that's good to hear. What do you think of Alex's tenure and the manner of his departure?
Well, I've said for a long time, and I can't be accused of being obsequious about it just now, because in a few weeks' time he'll have stepped down from being First Minister. But I said when I first met him in 1987, I just thought he was a remarkable politician. The outstanding politician, not just of his own generation, but of a number of generations. And having seen the work that he does in government, people won't get to see a lot of that stuff. The work we do in SCOR, which is the Government's Emergency Committee, when things like volcanic ash clouds or tough times in the winter time come around, or even just now in terms of Ebola, he is just fantastic at actually bringing people together, the right people together, and focusing the government on what the response has to be. He has been an absolutely remarkable politician, and of course he has the other attributes which people know in terms of debating, mastery of an argument, and putting forward the interests of the people of Scotland. Right back to that time in the 1980s when he stood up at the budget to protest against the poll tax. real courage in putting forward the argument for people of
Did
Scotland.
he pick up the mace?
He didn't know that was Michael Heseltine that did that and swung it around his head apparently, but no, he stood up just as the budget was starting, as he was entitled to do, and he made a protest about the poll tax which was being imposed on Scotland, and for his troubles was ejected from the House of Commons. But you know, to have 600 plus people baying at you in the way that they were, and to stand your ground, I think was remarkable, and I think he has that courage. And it'd be very interesting to see how he makes his presence felt in politics going forward.
It's unimaginable to me that he couldn't, that he would somehow disappear and play golf.
I think he'll take the chance to play some golf, knowing him as I do, but as you say, it's very hard to see how the presence that he's built up over these years could just disappear. I can't see that happening.
Absolutely. Can we just come on to HS2 just now? Because I had a fairly fierce debate with a very pro-unionist friend of mine, Peter Stabler, PhD, about the benefits of HS2. Now, I used to work in the Highways Agency in London, and you know, cost-benefit analysis has always intrigued me as an economic model. Does it have any benefit for Scotland, HS2?
Well, it has to come to Scotland to have the real benefits. Yes, of course, it could have some benefits by freeing up capacity on the line in England, but I think the real benefits will come not just for Scotland but for the whole of the UK if it comes to Scotland, which is what we've argued. For example, if you go to Edinburgh, Glasgow, if you're talking about sub 3 hour journey times, then that's when you see real modal shift, people getting off planes and using the train instead. That's a massive environmental benefit.
So modal being the type of transport.
You know, rather than planes, using trains for that. But over and above that, we have a real pressing need to increase the capacity for freight, especially in the West Coast Main Line, which has had around £9 billion spent on it fairly recently. And if they don't do HS2 coming right the way up to Scotland, then they're going to have to spend billions again, even after they've done HS2, on improving that line. So my point is to the UK government, let's do it all at once. And let's also make sure that the whole of the UK, as they see it, gets the whole benefit from this. And it's not just for Scotland. The amount of business coming from Scotland to the south and the points in between is huge as well. So this is, to me, a no-brainer. And it's also true to say that, as has been said by others, David Higgins included, you don't have to start at one end and work your way to the other. You can start at the other end and work in between. That's what we're doing in the Borders Rail.
Who have you spoken to? Who's your counterpart at Westminster in terms of transport?
Well, the Secretary of State for Transport is Patrick McLaughlin.
Right.
But I've dealt now, I think, with 3 or 4 Secretaries of State, and Patrick McLaughlin, a reasonable individual. He actually came to Scotland before the referendum and said that the problem in Scotland had been decades of underinvestment in the transport network, which is interesting because he was a former transport minister back in 1989. But so I think he understands that we need this investment, and it's part of modernising the railway infrastructure in Scotland. And it's not just about journey times and passengers; it's about freight as well.
It's about freight too, and things increasingly seem to get more linked up. I take it this is directly the Transport Minister in Scotland's job in terms of the tram now goes out to the airport. Mm-hmm. And I dare say you're doing the same in Glasgow, looking to do something similar in terms of linking that up. Had we won, what transport initiatives would have been put under steam straight away, do you think?
Well, a lot of them are dependent upon additional resources, and of course, had Scotland been independent, you have the opportunity to borrow. And borrowing is not always a good thing, as we've seen with the UK, £1.4 trillion in debt. But borrowing to produce infrastructure improvements benefits the economy. It's the right thing to borrow for. And so you could have seen a number of other things opening up. I've mentioned already in terms of the rail franchise, we could have looked at a public sector bid coming from Scotland to run the railways within Scotland. There are any number of infrastructure projects in terms of the roads. My mailbag is full with people's requests for bypasses to help local congestion points, for rail improvements. For example, in the North East in particular, we're doing stuff there. We'd like to do it more quickly. Obviously we have the A9 and A96 coming in terms of dualling, and that idea of dualling or having motorway between all of Scotland's cities is very important. So those things are being done. Independence would have allowed us, not least because of the additional borrowing powers that we'd had, to do more of that.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that I'd expected, and yeah, it would sound intriguing, and certainly get the economy moving. Back to the process and the stamina. What do you think your unique selling points are for the 85,000? We've touched on it, but what, Angela's is that she's the youngest. and she probably, I think you and she would both agree, wears kitten heels the best.
Yes, I've never tried them, although I'm wearing my special green shoes today, which Angela's commented on before. It's not a competition I'm ever going to win with Angela, to be honest. But I suppose for me, I think it's a combination really of the different experiences which I've had during the course of my life. And I think in particular, the work I did on the council, as a councillor for 11 years, and during that time...
Where was that, can you say?
I was in Clackmannanshire. And I became council leader shortly after having joined the council, and during that time we won the accolade of Best Council in Scotland. But I think the experience I had then of trying to bring different people together to make sure that we focused, and talking about transport, we managed to achieve, against I think considerable odds, the bringing of the railway back to Alloa, with the extension between Stirling, Alloa and onwards in freight terms to Kincardine. So I think we achieved a great deal there, and the experience from that time I think it stood me in good stead. 5 years now in government in different portfolios, housing, education. I'm now the longest serving transport minister under devolution, which some people think is more of a curse than an honour, but I think I have dealt with some of the difficult issues there, and I think that combination of experience, I think, and some of the resilience and determination I got in earlier careers would stand me in good stead.
Yeah, you've had a few. What did you do after the army, by the way?
I went
law.
No, I went
politics.
to college and politics. In fact, I was strongly pressed when I went to Dundee to do law, but I was genuinely interested in politics. And just as with the job in government, if you actually enjoy what you're doing, it's much easier to get through and achieve, I think.
Absolutely. I'm going to ask you some questions, which I think is only fair, given I've asked the same of them of Stuart. Do you support the idea of a united yes in the general election and beyond?
I think what we have to have is a means by which we continue with the broader Yes campaign. So I've suggested, for example, that we allow people, maybe encourage SNP branches to have people from different parties involved in Yes coming along and speaking to them, that we keep those links open, that we're inclusive and tolerant. These are easy things to say, but if you're in a room where you have different points of view being expressed, it's very important that we try to focus together on what we all want to achieve. There are practical limitations, as I've said. For example, we can't jointly canvass because that would affect data protection. And I also think that for the Westminster elections, we do have to be very focused on the fact that that's not, as the Holyrood elections are, a list system, an open system. A first past the post rewards a very concentrated vote, and I think we have to concentrate for that reason on the SNP, and that's been endorsed, if you like, by people like Tommy Sheridan and Caroline Leckie saying vote SNP in 2015. But if you can do that at the same time as carrying the broader Yes movement with us, I'm very interested in how we do that.
One of the ideas that was suggested by Professor Joe Goldblatt was that there'd be focus on developing a constitution which would bring in the existing Yes parties and perhaps other parts of the Better Together campaign too.
Well, I mean, we had plans for that had there been a yes vote. Of course, we'd looked at the example in Iceland and also making sure it's an inclusive process where people themselves felt a part of establishing a constitution. I think it's an idea which I think we will see come forward during the policy processes which I mentioned and through the structures which I'd like to see put in place. I'm quite keen not to be seen to lay down policy or to be too definitive before we have that process of people coming together and having that discussion. And in that regard, I think what would be particularly interesting are the rallies which Nicola Sturgeon is holding, which I think is a fantastic idea, because my experience since the election at Yes meetings has been that people want to get together, talk about their experiences in the referendum and express how they want to go forward. So I think those processes will help us decide how we go forward.
One of the complaints of the massive Yes majority in social media was that it ended up talking to itself and didn't actually go out there and convert and proselytise. One of the questions, guy from Martin Pike, what is the plan for achieving Indy now? The 50%, 55% won't go away. How can we reach into that 55%?
Well, of course, they're not going to go away, and I think the only way that we can convince enough people to support independence in fashion. So I mentioned before how we try and look within the party to establish a youth academy. Some people have proposed to me they'd like to see an older people's forum whereby older people within the party can come together but also be the ambassadors to older people, many of whom voted no in the referendum, to try and convince them that their aspirations that they have, whether it's for pensions, for social security, for that safety net, it can best be met by independence. The only way we're going to change 45% into a larger number is to convince people, hearts and minds. It's the way to do it. And starting off with a resource of 80,000 plus people is a pretty good start to my mind.
Yes, that's a very good start. You know, you're at Holyrood, the next election is at Westminster. Would it be fair to say the battleground has moved to Westminster for the time being?
Well, people have different views on that. I always think that the Scottish Parliament, and just now the additional powers for the Scottish Parliament, has to be the central argument of the SNP and independent supporting parties. But of course we have colleagues at Westminster who've got a difficult job to do, you know, currently 6 MPs among 600 plus. But I do think that we have to always retain our focus. For example, that's why I think Nicola and Alec have decided that John Swinney and Linda Fabiani should lead in terms of the Smith Commission. The Scottish Parliament is what all of us, MPs, councillors, MSPs, are focused on improving in terms of the powers that it has. So that would be my focus, but it's entirely legitimate. I don't want there to be any doubt about this. Entirely legitimate for somebody from Westminster to say they would want to try and focus it from that direction.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can understand that you're probably right then, that more vows is the battleground just now. That's where we have to, you know, the yes and no's continue the argument until the future. And then it comes to the Westminster election in May. This is a tough question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, because I asked it of Stuart, and it's only fair I think you'd agree. If you have leadership qualities, why didn't you challenge Nicola?
Well, I think over the time that I've known Nicola, and also probably especially during the referendum campaign, I think she'd established herself as almost a leader in waiting. I mean, whether it was in the debates that she'd undertaken, the way that she'd absolutely demolished the arguments of 2 Secretaries of State for Scotland on TV, just the power of work that she's put in as well. She has longer experience in the Parliament than I do. She's been in the Parliament since its inception in 1999. And I have absolutely no trouble, as I'm doing just now, in working to Nicola, if you like, as my boss. I think she's shown those qualities and she more than deserves the opportunity to take this job on. And she'll do a great job at it. So I've no qualms about that at all. It was only when Nicola had decided she was going for it that I thought, well, the Deputy Leader's post is a possibility.
And you were encouraged into?
Especially by my parliamentary colleagues. I was genuinely taken aback by that, the number of MSPs who'd asked me to...
Rosanna Cunningham, Margaret Burgess, Alex Neil, Hamza Youssef, Michael Matheson. Is that about... And a lot more besides, obviously.
I think it's upwards of 40, 45 now, yeah.
Right, and that's a heck of a lot. Now, I'm just going to continue these questions because they're not necessarily sequential. They're just as they came to me via Twitter and via Facebook. Huge influx of new members. What will happen to the balance and direction of the party? Will it change?
Well, I was asked this question by another journalist who said, is this not a threat because these new members might take the party off in a different direction? And I just do not see it that way at all. I don't see this as a threat. I see it as a massive opportunity which any other party would be delighted to have that level of resource. But that's the nature of a democratic party. It has to be responsive to its members. And far from trying to put limits on what the new members are able to do, they'll have the same rights as existing members. I'd like to facilitate their right to make sure they develop policy. And to me, that's just a really exciting prospect.
Absolutely, and one of those would be the regional assemblies that you've talked about. What's your reflections on what went right for Yes in terms of the referendum campaign and what didn't go right for Yes in terms of the referendum campaign?
Well, I've said a number of times now, on the day of the referendum itself, myself and my 2 sons were doing a knock-up in Tullabury, a place called the Braes in Tullabury, and I've never, in the 30 years I've been involved in politics, seen anything quite like this. There was Yes posters in virtually every window. Both my sons had the Yes t-shirts, which they had on taken off them by people who wanted them, whether it was pens or balloons, and it took us so long to do a fairly straightforward knock-up because we were being stalked the whole way. And looking back on it, although it was an exhilarating experience, it really was about the fact that some people who had never voted before, and not even registered to vote, really had a hope that this was different, that something was going to really be positive in this. And it kind of broke down for the first time in a number of elections, that level of cynicism which has been there with a section of society. And in this case, as in many other cases, a pretty disadvantaged section of society. So I think one thing the Yes campaign got absolutely right was instilling that level of enthusiasm and energy. These have become cliches now, but it really was evident at that time that they did that.
It's only a month. They can't become cliches at this stage. It's not enough time's elapsed.
Well, it's been said by everybody to that extent it's become a cliche, but I think it's absolutely there.
Yeah, because the Yes campaign, we had Blair Jenkins in here. It was very, very well run, and yet still lost by 10%. Why was that?
Well, that's right, and we have to examine why we lost by 10%. There was a feeling amongst many people on the no side as well that we were ahead shortly before that. I do think that when I joined in 1984, we were at about 12% in the polls, and I said on the morning, because I did media right through till about 8:30 in the morning, that 45% itself was a stunning achievement, and we shouldn't lose sight of that fact, having gone from 12 to 45%. But the other element to it is the extent to which we've normalised the idea of independence in Scotland. In the distant past, when I joined, it was a minority sport believing in independence. It certainly isn't now, and people have been exposed to the arguments. What we've now got to do, which we weren't able to do enough of, is to overcome those arguments, sometimes those fears about independence, and also make sure that we say to people who've got aspirations for themselves and their families, this is how you can better achieve these aspirations.
And I suppose one of the difficulties, it was the British state that Yes was up against, and it had to demonstrate a case to the people, whilst a lot of institutional support was for no. As Deputy Party Leader, what can be done with those institutions? What can you suggest to the new membership that they could usefully do?
Well, it depends, of course, which institutions you're talking about. Certainly big business, I think we had a very good argument and actually a much more broadly based business representation within Yes Scotland, but we have to be able to take on some of those arguments that are presented to us. Some of them, I think, quite absurd. Things like oil companies that couldn't foresee dealing properly in an independent Scotland, but currently deal in places around the world which are far from democratic, far from stable. So I think we have to be better able to make sure we can, it's not really to try and change that kind of institutional point of view, it's change people's minds about the views of those institutions, if you like. And even some of the stuff we had about, some appalling stuff like children not being able to be treated at Great Ormond Street, things like that, which Great Ormond Street themselves
refuted.
So I think we have to go back to some of those things and put our case to people that were perhaps swayed by some of those arguments.
I suppose that would be class 101 in terms of dealing with the media in the academies, the youth academy, the older people, which I'll soon be joining, I reckon, the older people academies as well. How you can effectively deal with broadcasters and media and potentially institutions as well. Because one of the things to fall out of the campaign was the institutional belonging of the CBI rather than it being for business. That's quite an astonishing situation that developed there. Now, what will happen if you didn't win?
Well, then that would be entirely up to the person that wins. Will have to take forward these issues, big, really exciting issues. That would be down to them. But for me, it would just be a question of, first of all, continue to represent my constituents in Clackmannanshire and Dunblane, and if there's a role for me in government, it would be down to the First Minister to decide that. Then getting on with that, and maybe a bit more sleep, I would imagine.
Well, I hope the three of you some more sleep. I mean, it seems to me you've really knocked your socks off, and I wish that you'd catch up on that and get some rest. I think Stuart was carrying a bit of a cold when he was here earlier, because I think all three of you've all got kids, and you're on really important jobs, and then you're campaigning as well, all over the country, it would seem.
Yeah.
Fraserburgh and various other places in between.
Inverness, it's right down to Dumfries as well. Yeah.
Inverness. In terms of the direction the new First Minister will take the party, where do you think that will be?
Well, I take a lot of encouragement from essentially the first announcement that Nicola's made about these large-scale events that she's going to be at and taking questions. It really responds to what was a very tangible demand from not just from within the SNP, but the broader Yes movement, to be accessible, to allow people to have their say. Which is also, I think, quite rightly focused on the welfare and job-creating powers. I think these are really important. I mentioned...
In terms of the vow?
Yeah, well, no, in terms of making sure that's what her focus is, because the pressing situation in Scotland is to do with these welfare powers. I've called it asymmetric austerity, whereby what the UK...
Hold on. asymmetric austerity, right? Just be clear on that. That's what you just said there.
Yeah, and if I can explain that a little bit.
Please do. Yeah.
Instead of being equally presented to the entire population, I think it's disproportionately going to those, the pain of austerity is disproportionately going to those that are hurting the most. And there's been a protection for high wage earners, for example, and I think that has presented real issues in Scotland to the extent that we have an absolute growth industry in terms of food banks, which we would never have dreamt of happening since perhaps the 1930s. But to have that in a supposedly and actually extremely wealthy, prosperous country, I think is an affront to Scottish society. And I think Nicola has quite rightly identified having the welfare powers and the job creation powers. Now, as you mentioned earlier on, I think we've done extremely well in terms of job creation. We've now got unemployment down to around 5.5%. But it's quite clear there are many people that want to either work or to work more than they currently do, because perhaps they're part-time, to give them the chance to have a reasonable standard of life for their families. And I think that's got to be, I think Nicola's quite right to take things in that direction.
And do you think that will start to eat into the 55%?
Well, first of all, I think it's worth doing for its own sake.
Yes.
Regardless of what anyone's point of view is, we have to try and address this. It's obvious to me in any event, seeing the food banks in my own local area, but it was also obvious to me going to areas in Tilbury and Alloa where there was obviously real need there. So it's something we should do. And of course, for every SNP member, you have two things on your membership card. One is to achieve independence, national sovereignty, and the other is to further the interests of the Scottish people. We are the Government of Scotland, and we have to take that extremely seriously. I think we have done by what we've done so far, but now is the time for a renewed focus on those points which Nicola has laid out. So it's worth doing in its own way. But I think, part of that will be reaching to people that felt sceptical about what independence could achieve. And if we can show further progress in terms of job creation, alleviating, and that's what we have to do in many cases, alleviating the worst aspects of some of the welfare changes which are coming from Westminster, then I think that will help convince the hearts and minds that we need to.
And I suppose that there really is dependent on, there is scope to do that within the existing settlement. And there would be a hope that there would be more capacity to do so after the Smith results come in and are delivered and are made made law. But what can you do in the interim?
Well, we've already done quite a number of things, not least the issue of the bedroom tax, where we put in place a provision to make sure that nobody should have to suffer from the financial consequences of the bedroom tax. And we have to continue doing that. Again, in terms of the job creation, looking for new opportunities to finance some of the infrastructure improvements. It's not just that it creates jobs with all the benefits that has for families and so on. It's also that it makes the economy of Scotland more productive. And if you have the proper road, rail, air and sea links, if you can have those, and also some of the other infrastructure projects that we want to undertake, proper broadband, for example, then you start to increase the potential of the country to earn more as a country. But that's only meaningful if we can make sure that people within the country are receiving the benefit from that. There's an appalling figure just now where 5 families have got the combined wealth of 12 million people, and that shouldn't be the case. That level of inequality is incompatible with a properly functioning society, in my view. And perhaps a testament to that is the food banks that we've seen. So those are the things that we have to concentrate on in the meantime.
Yes, exactly. You have 3 children, is it?
That's right, yeah.
Do you get to see them much?
Well, one son, the youngest son, still lives at home with me.
Right.
He's at college doing music. My 2 other children are in Aberdeen. So this week I had 5 meetings in Aberdeen on Monday and spent dinner with them. My older son comes down to mine for the weekend, so I see a lot of him. Not as much of my daughter as I used to do, but as often as we can, yeah. And I'll be down for Christmas as well. So.
Well, as long as because you've got to make time for. I don't know why I'm getting all worried about all concerned about the welfare and the family time of the contestants, but anyway, I am. It's what I do. Let's just make a final pitch. Middle camera there. What have you got to say to potentially 84,000 of a constituency?
Well, my particular pitch is that I believe I have the experience, whether it's through working in the Scottish Government for a number of years as a minister in different and quite challenging portfolios, transport and education and housing amongst them. That experience, and also my experience previously on a local authority, I believe I've got that experience. I've got, I think, the drive and the determination, and I think the ability to pull people together to make sure that we can make sure that every single member of the SNP has a chance to participate to the level that they want to do.
Well, I think that's a fairly decent point to bring the show to an end on this occasion. I'd just like to thank Keith Brown for taking the time out of a hectic schedule of hustings and meanwhile running a ministry too. Thank you very much, Keith Brown.
Thank you.
Good luck in your contest. It's been an absolute pleasure meeting you today. That's all from Referendum TV. Thank you very much for joining us. We'll be back shortly. Bye-bye.